For those that have listened to Bob's most recent episode, episode 42, you're probably wondering about the surveillance footage from the neighbour across the street. By the time you hear this, for those that are interested, I've now uploaded all of the video footage on our website. Go to truthisjustice.com, click on Cases and then the Melgar case, and scroll down and you will see the link to neighbour surveillance footage. On his episode, Bob made certain comments which appear to suggest that we here at Truth is Justice made the deliberate decision to not upload the surveillance footage because it contains something beneficial to Sandra, and more importantly, detrimental to the state's case. Now remember, the important link here is the claim that we are funded by the state of Texas. I addressed the surveillance footage issue in a post on our Facebook page several hours ago, and the responses I received were interesting. A couple of the people who posted comments are of the view that I was hiding this material for some reason, and they were curious why. And that's an interesting view to take. Now, I'll offer up a couple of explanations. Feel free to pick which one you believe is the truth. The timing of these claims is actually quite amusing. When you hear the rest of this episode, you'll understand why. If this isn't reaching the absolute heights of conspiracy theory, I don't know what is. So for the first explanation. We received the same files that Bob received of the surveillance footage. It was 5 executable files. Now, unlike Bob, I have some IT knowledge, but that wasn't really needed for these files. You double click on them and voila, the video player opens and shows you the video. Now, because it's an executable file, Windows and whatever malware or antivirus protection software you have in your machine will throw up a warning that the file could be damaging. And that's a legitimate warning. A .exe file can do some harm. Now, obviously, I initially disregarded that warning and launched the file anyway. I probably watched 10 seconds of one of the clips. It isn't exactly gripping viewing, and I have far better things to do with my time than watch hours of a basketball hoop and 2 cars in low resolution doing pretty much nothing. When we launched the website last year, it was an enormous effort. For those that have created a website with large amounts of data embedded, you will know what I mean. Many gigabytes of data were sorted, organised, tagged, uploaded and embedded to various pages, a process that took hundreds of hours. The easiest ones were slightly time consuming. The difficult ones, well, they seemingly took forever to get ready to publish. Now, I don't actually recall specifically my decision on the surveillance footage. I may have decided that an executable file provided on our page as a download would present some problems. Now, on a side note, can you imagine the claims that would have been made against our page if we had an executable file available for download masquerading as a video file? The first person to download it would say, "Why am I getting a warning message when I go to run this file?" Anyway, whatever the reason, the time, priorities, security, whatever the reason, I didn't upload the videos. It's important to note that this was the only footage provided to us in that format, so the only one that required you to run an executable file to make it function. The Luminol footage, for example, that was in video format and could be uploaded directly, and it was. And why was this video provided in that format? I have no idea. Now, someone asked a question on another page about the video a few months ago. I think it was about what area the footage covered. I saw that question and opened one of the files, took a couple of screenshots and posted them to show what area the footage covered. Now, a couple of general points. Have you noticed that the things that have been discovered from all of the material being available on our website haven't been discovered by me? The IT report? Well, that was a huge find by the brilliant Adam. The TV model based on the receipt? Well, that was a combination of Tom's efforts and those by Adam. The assumed original location of the towels found in the jacuzzi? That was Adam. The marijuana transaction, the suspicious glass item in a pot plant, and all of the other quite incredible discoveries by Danielle, and there's been discoveries by Debbie, and so many others. I can't take credit for a single one of those. Well, except for my effort in making the material available on our website. Now, does it strike you as odd that I wouldn't bring all of those different elements to everyone's attention sooner? I mean, surely I would do that almost immediately, and presumably I would also claim credit for them myself. So surely, if I was hiding material that was exculpatory for Sandra, I would also be aware of material that was damaging for her and not publicly released, and I would share that as quickly as I could. So finishing up this first explanation, and remember, I'll offer up another one, and you can choose which to believe. So we have some interesting material to raise in the coming weeks. material which I think nullifies some of those outrageous claims made by Bob over the previous few weeks. Now, unlike Bob, when we have information, and we do get information from many sources, very interesting information, and when we have that, we check, double check, triple check, and then we often pass it all to someone else to check again before we release it. We have that luxury because we don't promote bras or the sale of bed sheets or any other external pressure that requires us to very recklessly upload content regardless of whether it is accurate or not. Think about the difference in the way this is all being handled. So we had the forensic IT report. We uploaded it. We had the marijuana transaction document. We uploaded it. Has Bob uploaded either of those? And does that mean that he is secretly hiding material that implicates Sandra in Jim's murder? And now, to the second, and I think way more exciting explanation. So, yes, you got me. This was the day that I dreaded and that I hoped would never come to pass. I deliberately withheld the surveillance footage after watching it late last year and realising that it showed something that could potentially help Sandra. I withheld that footage, successfully convincing Addie and Ivan that it was the best thing to do because they also had access to the same files and obviously thought something was up. And I did all of that because the reality is I didn't want the actual truth to come out. I knew it was out there. I mean, I know that I'm not the only one to have the footage, but I really did think that by not uploading it myself, no one else would upload it or pay any attention to it, and the mystery of the intruders would forever lay undiscovered. The incredible thing with the power of this second explanation is this. You can ask yourself, what else do I know? What other potentially exculpatory evidence do I have in my possession that I am withholding? Now, Bob said that every single document from the case file is up on our website. Well, honestly, that isn't exactly true. There are many documents that we have that haven't been uploaded, and things that we have since discovered that we haven't yet shared publicly. Now, does Bob have any of those? I don't know. Maybe he does, and he hasn't yet found out what they contain, or maybe he never received them and doesn't know they exist. See, if I'm the type of person that would deliberately withhold the surveillance footage, you have to go with the second explanation. But where does that leave you? It leaves you scratching your head about what other information could be out there. Who else was interviewed behind the scenes? What other witnesses were originally going to be called and weren't? What tips were received but were kept under wraps? Am I really connected with some people close to this case, and this whole thing is a complex effort to prevent embarrassment? Is that why efforts to research my background have been somewhat unsuccessful? So what a dilemma. But that is what conspiracy theories do, I suppose. Welcome to Truth is Justice.
Without truth, there can be no justice.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, Your Honor.
Speak out. Ask those questions. Demand that truth.
Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of Truth is Justice. Before we get into looking at the rest of Bob's interview with Jim Clemente, I wanted to briefly touch on conspiracy theories. Now, I'm not someone who is big on conspiracy. I believe the moon landing happened, and also believe the Earth is round. But I'm also from Australia, and according to some flat Earth theories, Australia does not exist, and those people that claim they are from Australia are simply actors. I suppose that part does indeed fit with the claims that I don't exist, but anyway. I understand that people do believe in various conspiracy theories to greater or lesser degrees depending on the person. Now, I'm of the view that it is incredibly difficult to convince someone of a truth if they believe that there is a conspiracy surrounding it. So for every 1,000 reasons you can point to prove that the moon landing happened, there will be 10,000 reasons given for those explanations to be false, or for the person saying them to simply be someone who is in on the conspiracy. So regardless of the science, regardless of the common sense, it is next to impossible to properly and effectively communicate the truth to those people. On the other hand, sharing welcomed information with a conspiracy group is relatively easy. A group believing the Earth is flat, for example, will welcome with open arms and a round of applause any information that supports their position, regardless of whether that explanation makes sense or not, regardless of whether that explanation has any scientific support. Now, a friend shared with me a story along the lines of what I've just said, and I thought it was absolutely hilarious. And then I went away and I thought about it a lot. So if you could find a completely innocent but unusual group of pixels on the moon landing video, or an anomaly that you couldn't immediately explain because you were not skilled in that area, you could potentially generate a huge amount of interest in what you were saying. And in fact, we've seen that. So some of you might remember the rocks that were shaped like a face on Mars. And that was huge news amongst various conspiracy theorists and in general media. And whilst NASA didn't initially comment, when they did, it just made it worse amongst conspiracy theorists. From what I can remember, NASA released photos from slightly different angles that showed what appeared to be a face was simply a trick played by the lighting. When you saw the rock formation from different angles, it looked nothing like a face. But of course, the easy conspiracy theorist response is that NASA doctored the other photos, or that the other photos didn't actually exist and were just computer generated by NASA, or similar arguments. And then you have the argument that if NASA didn't believe there was any merit to it, why did they respond in the first place? And that is exactly why it is almost impossible to successfully argue against conspiracy theorists. There is always, in their eyes, a plausible counter-argument to whatever you offer up. So why am I saying all of this? Because I'm of the view that Bob takes advantage of a craving amongst some of his most devout followers for conspiracy theories, and that many of those followers have a strong general belief in conspiracy. I read the other day a post that highlighted the potential for Sandra's recently claimed turn of bad health to have some connection with her upcoming appeals. Now, the author of the post suggested that a reason for Sandra not being provided with adequate medical care is that it was the authorities' way of preventing her from attending her appeals, or perhaps having the motivation and strength to appeal. So try and wrap your head around the scale of conspiracy needed to make that happen. It would require quite an extraordinary level of cooperation amongst prison officials, guards, medical personnel, actors throughout the justice system, and quite possibly members of Sandra's own defence team to make it happen. So reading that, it struck me how conspiracy suggestions have been sprinkled all over Bob's review of this case. From the very beginning, it has been about the detectives and the prosecutor conspiring against Sandra. Then the crime scene investigators were involved. The first response medics, the first response police, and remember, with the first police responders, they actually had to have been in on the conspiracy before even arriving at the house, meaning that the conspiracy was already in full swing before the 911 call was even made. But approaching the case in this way has been very effective for Bob. Now, a fallen poster could simply be a fallen poster. But viewing it from a conspiracy angle, it could tell you an enormous amount about the supposed intruders. I mean, based simply on the poster, you may be able to determine, or at least suggest, the gender, the age, the height, and the hair colour of the intruder who brushed past it. Now, even the presence of items found in an ordinary everyday home can have a meaning attached to them. So the large flat-screen TV in the living room, for example, from the fact that the TV wasn't stolen, it was determined that the intruders were likely on foot. So debating those scenarios is always going to be 100% ineffective for a certain group of people who deeply believe in it. So how can I prove that the person who made the poster fall off the wall wasn't a male, 6 foot 4 inches, brown hair and aged 28 years old? I can't. So it very possibly could have been dramatically pulled from the wall by a person fitting exactly that description. Or, for that matter, it could have been put off the wall by 16 people all at once who desperately wanted the last copy of that poster and were prepared to murder someone for it and to take an Xbox at the same time. So the underlying purpose of this podcast and the website has been questioned over and over again. People have mulled over who is involved in this and why it was created. You've all heard the suggestions that we are funded by the state of Texas, or personally funded by some of those connected with the case, or that this whole thing is a complex ruse to deflect attention because I am actually the murderer. Now, the point keeps being made that we stand out in the true crime field because we are seen as defending the prosecution in some way. It is like someone jumping on a moon landing conspiracy forum and saying that they believe the astronauts and NASA are being open and upfront. And that will not be accepted easily, and it would be very easily claimed that you are simply from NASA or connected with an astronaut, and that is why you are going to the trouble of defending them. It would never be accepted by that group that you are simply doing it because you are interested in the truth. And it's the same in this scenario. I believe Ms. Barnett was being open and upfront and presented the case exceptionally well. I believe everyone else that is involved, all the names you are all no doubt familiar with by now, are also being upfront and transparent. Ms. Rossi, Mr. Carpenter, Mr. Carazol, Mr. Ducey. I don't for one second believe that all of them are involved in a deep conspiracy, which is also incredibly connected with the prison system and the medical profession. Now remember, we are talking about Sandra Melgar and the murder of her husband Jim. We're not talking about a complex state secrets matter involving multiple countries, political assassinations and spies. In many instances, secrets can't even be kept in those circumstances, so the likelihood that these secrets are kept in the case of Sandra are very low. The broader point I'm making here is this. We endeavour to correct statements that are misleading or false, and those that misrepresent the evidence. Those that believe in the Sandra Melgar conspiracy will not accept anything I say or believe any material that we present. There is no scenario in my mind where presenting a case and adding in false and misleading statements and not being challenged on those statements is appropriate. So someone asked me during the week whether I would put out a formal apology and retract everything I've said if evidence comes forward that shows Sandra is innocent. Now, aside from my opinion that the possibility of that happening is somewhere in the region of nil, of course I wouldn't retract the corrections we have made. For someone to think that I would be to misunderstand everything that I have done with this podcast and that we as a team have done with the website. It is about showing what is right and what is wrong, what are lies and what are facts. To present a case like the Melgars and misrepresent the facts or completely lie about the facts is to produce a work of fiction, and that is exactly what I believe that Bob has done. Many of his devout followers argue that there is nothing wrong with that his intentions are good, so they say that he can go about it in whatever way he wants to. They say that it doesn't matter whether he tells 10 lies to the one truth. If it achieves the underlying purpose, being to free someone convicted of a horrible crime, then it is fully justified, and he should be given a pass on the misleading statements and misrepresentations. For that group of people, the devout followers, fact-checking has no relevance and definitely has no place. I do, however, suggest that a point will come where fiction produced by skilled authors and presenters will become more appealing to those people than a manufactured form of true crime fiction produced by someone who has a complete disregard for the people involved in the matters and a complete disregard for the full and actual truth. In the coming weeks, you'll hear us present more examples of exactly why it can be said that what Bob presents is fiction, and we will demonstrate that his show really is a perfect example of not letting the truth get in the way of a good story. We are Truth is Justice, and we are setting the record straight. second part of the interview that Bob broadcasts with Jim Clemente starts with an interesting back and forth between them. It centres around the final part of their blood spatter analysis discussion in the first part of the interview. Specifically, the theory that Jim presents that certain blood drops on the back of the chair may indicate multiple drops in the one spot. As I said last week, I'm not even a blood spatter novice, let alone an expert, but I think I'm reasonably good at analysing the way discussions develop and the purpose behind certain statements. And this particular interaction between Jim and Bob stood out to me as unusual for a number of reasons. It seemed obvious to me that Jim was leading towards something, a specific statement, and indeed he was. Bob offers up the scenario, a scenario he asks Jim to comment on, whether it could be plausible or possible, whereby the murderer stands in the area next to the doorway to the closet and proceeds to clean themselves off. Jim then describes a situation where a rag they were cleaning themselves with was literally completely soaked with blood and flung back, hitting the chair, causing blood drops to drip down and cause the drops that Bob and Jim so carefully analysed. Now, don't worry, the playing of dramatic musical clips will likely not become a frequent event on this podcast, at least not yet. But feel free to imagine a dramatic musical backing right now, because Jim finishes his description of this scenario with a statement about the rag, which Bob adds significant drama to in this opening. Now, Jim's now dramatically presented statement was that for Bob's scenario to be considered plausible required a towel or a rag to be found at the crime scene. His actual words were, "Where's this bloody rag? Where's these bloody clothes?" Now, I might talk about this a little bit more next week, but if you get a chance, have a look on our website and the photos of the master bedroom. Now, picture a soaked towel. Now, if you haven't held a completely blood-soaked towel, soaked to the point that blood is dripping off it, maybe picture a water-soaked towel instead. We're talking about a massive amount of blood needed for it to be dripping from the towel. Now, picture it being flung and hitting the chair. Have a look around the chair, and for that matter, have a look around the room. Do you see the large number of drops on the carpet leading to the master bathroom from this blood-soaked towel? I can't see them. Now imagine that water-soaked towel. Imagine trying to get that water-soaked towel from the closet to the jacuzzi. Now that's something difficult to picture. My point is that to make Bob's scenario work, Jim surmised that you would need a blood-soaked towel. A towel so soaked with blood that the blood is dripping from it and being flung at a chair and dripping specifically in only one small area. Now, it wasn't presented that way though. It was presented that the scenario Bob laid out was plausible, with very little attention paid to the things needed to make it plausible. The dramatic music seemed to distract perfectly in that respect. You'll remember me talking last week about how Jim Clemente apparently had no awareness of certain aspects of the case, including whether the Melgars went to dinner or whether the murder occurred before they had a chance to go out for dinner, whether the car used to go to dinner was parked inside or outside, and whether Jim and Sandra had any children. And then we had Jim's knowledge of the period of time between when Liz and her ex-husband had separated, which seemed to not fit with some of his earlier statements. Now we have Jim not having any knowledge of the towels and the blouse in the jacuzzi, another aspect of the case that I assume would be one of the first things you would become aware of with respect to this case. The contents of the jacuzzi, being the murder weapon and the towels and the blouse, they're crucial bits of information. So did Jim genuinely have no idea about whether a towel and clothing was found, or was Jim perhaps helping the dramatisation and entertainment value of the podcast by leading into that scenario of Bob's with a small oversight and small little misdirection to potentially pique everyone's interest? He did immediately after that statement refer to the white blouse. Now Bob hadn't noted the colour of it yet, only noting that it was a woman's blouse. Again, it may just be that Jim was reading along as he was talking, or looking at photos on the fly, who knows. But what we do know is that the scenario of that blood-soaked towel being flung around is then stated as being something that helps Jim form a preliminary profile, as Bob calls it, of the person that murdered Jim. It didn't matter that the blood-soaked and dripping towel wasn't really reflected in the photographic evidence. That is simply a small detail that can presumably be easily overlooked. Another indication that Jim had read something is the reference he made to Sandra being restrained in the closet with the chair wedged under the door handle. Jim even notes his knowledge that the pillow sham was suggested by the prosecution as being used to pull the chair towards the door. Now, as I've pointed out, I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means, but Jim seems to claim no knowledge of very significant aspects of the case, and yet, at the same time, reflect an intricate knowledge of certain related elements of the case, something like the pillow sham. Now, I just find that strange. Jim asks Bob whether the process of hopping out of the jacuzzi could have been something that triggered Sandra's seizure. A couple of points to note here. This point was never addressed by the defence at trial, but has been discussed heavily since trial, and has been a significant element of the speculation. Dr. Hershkowitz wasn't asked about it, and he didn't provide an opinion on it. As I spoke about at length last week, if that was an element the defence thought was plausible, or something that Dr. Hershkowitz thought particularly likely or relevant, then I presume that would have been something important for them to raise. We have heard how Sandra would frequently soak in the jacuzzi. If that is the case, then I'm sure Sandra would have been aware of the risks of soaking in the jacuzzi and presumably would have been able to manage those risks. If that isn't true, and Sandra didn't frequently take a jacuzzi, then it represents another very significant coincidence. The jacuzzi, for Sandra, represents an absolutely vital part of the narrative. Without the jacuzzi element, Sandra can't explain not hearing the intruders. She can't explain why she wasn't with Jim. She can't explain why Jim was naked. She can't explain why she didn't know that anyone was on the laptop at those times. So it's integral to so many events that night. And Bob and Jim then talk about the safe and how the safe handle wasn't tested. Jim makes note of how the blood on the handle could very well be the killer's. We've spoken about the safe handle at length, so I won't go into that too much here. What I will say is this. Bob highlights the fact that no other DNA other than Jim's was found on the blade of the knife. Now that would seem to indicate that it was only Jim that was stabbed with the knife. I'm unsure whether it is claimed that the supposed intruder was injured with the knife or with something else, but still, it's interesting that that wasn't considered when Jim discussed the safe handle. Now, Bob and Jim then have a lengthy discussion of the pillow. You might recall the throw pillow that was found on the floor leaning against the wall. The suggestion by Jim is that the intruders brought the pillow with them to use as something to potentially smother someone. I'm no intruder or home invader, but I am reasonably sure that someone who is smart enough to think ahead that they may need to smother someone would realise that a pillow of some sort would probably be available in an occupied home. Now, I know Jim is world-renowned though, so perhaps there is a reason for why the intruders would bring their own smothering pillow, and I just simply can't think of it. Jim then went to some lengths to describe how unlikely it would be for Sandra to defecate on herself. He said that he has never heard of anyone doing that in a crime situation. Now, I won't talk about this too much, but if you're interested, please go back and listen to our episode 21, which was the episode about Ralph Candelario. Bob then asks Jim for a preliminary profile, and Jim describes what his thoughts are. He notes the following. This is the kind of crime that is not very well thought out. It's not something that comes from compulsion. It's not something that comes from intellect, planning, and successful repetition. That this is something that got out of hand. That clearly there was an attempt to control Jim. It failed for at least a period of time, and there was a lot of struggle and altercation. And whoever did this to Jim had physical evidence of that on their person. That is, not only his blood all over them, but they must have gotten injured in this process. Jim notes that there is plenty of indication that he, meaning Jim, engaged in that fight, referring to a life or death fight, and suggests as part of that the person who Jim fought would have sustained injuries. Now, he isn't pushed on that point at all, nor does he expand on it. It's been claimed many times that Jim engaged in a brutal fight with his attacker. I've also spoken before about how Jim didn't have any injuries to his knuckles and no foreign DNA under his fingernails. So I do then wonder how exactly Jim inflicted these suggested injuries to his attacker. Jim notes that the person who did this was motivated by something other than murder. They were motivated by greed. And I agree. As we spoke about last week, I think Sandra's post-Jim life was not indicative of someone who had lost their one and only caregiver and someone who was deeply traumatised. Jim wraps up his analysis to say that he believes that both Jim and Sandra were originally hit on the head before the main part of the attack commenced. No evidence is provided to support that, and remember, Jim only a short time ago had no idea about significant elements of the case. So I really do struggle with the ability for Jim to prepare such a seemingly thorough analysis of who committed the crime when literally an hour ago he claims to have no knowledge of some of the very basic aspects of the case. Now, I believe Jim is an intelligent man, and I believe his work throughout his career is well recognised, and his television career in writing for Criminal Minds has been very successful. But there just seems to be some things related to his knowledge of the case, or at least his claimed knowledge of the case, that seem to be a little bit off. Jim further notes that in his view, Jim was attacked in 2 stages. That he was first injured to control him, and then he was probably bound, at least partially, and then Jim believes that he woke up and started fighting back, and that is when the fight went into the closet. Jim notes that it may be that the attackers hit him over the head whilst he was in that chair, and then tied him up and threw him in the closet, and he woke up and started kicking and fighting. That does seem, to Jim, to be consistent with what happened there. And Jim finishes up with the following statement. And again, if you want to add your own dramatic musical overlay here, please do. Now, I don't know. I'm just feeling like there may have been a serious injustice here. And Bob wraps up the episode by talking about Jim's profile and his analysis of the case, noting that theory has finally been confronted with a factual analysis. Perhaps it's just me, but Jim seems to be claiming to have no knowledge of significant aspects of the case, and at the same time claiming to have such an in-depth knowledge of the case based on Bob's summaries that he can claim an injustice has occurred. How does that balance out? Thank you for listening to Truth is Justice. We look forward to you joining us next week as we continue to set the record straight.